Дакийн Dulguun байна. Та бүхэнд өнөөдөр Dulguun's podcast буюу Dulguun-ы подкастыг хүрэхээр бэлтгэлээ. За энэ подкастаараа би та бүхэнд эдийн засгийн, нийгмийн, бизнесийн ертөнцөд болж байгаа шинэ соргог мэдээллийг ялангуяа та бүхэн хэрхэн мөнгөө өсгөж хөрөнгө оруулалт хийх вэ гэдэг өнцгөөс ялангуяа хөрөнгөний зах зээл талаас нь та бүхний магадгүй таньдаггүй ийм эксперт буюу мэдээлэл их сурвалж болсон хүмүүстэй уулзуулж мэдээлэл хүргэх болно. За энэ удаагийн анхны дугаар маань 2022 оны эдийн засгийн нөхцөл байдлыг авч үзээд ямар хөө хөрөнгө оруулалтын сонголтууд байх вэ гэдэг талаар би ноён Алекстай ярихаар бэлтгэсэн байна. За ингээд Алекстайгаа ярилцгаая. So Alex, please introduce yourself to our viewers and listeners.
Well, firstly, thank you for inviting me today to be part of this podcast. My background is primarily in Mongolian real estate investing. I have been in Mongolia now for actually 12 years, undertaking various research, market analysis, and also investment structuring for around about $1.3 billion worth of total construction value of real estate. My business extended from Mongolia around about 6 years ago to include Korea, Myanmar, more recently Sri Lanka, and also have significant holdings in the US in terms of construction and development, and also novel real estate investments, including co-working.
Oh yeah. Thank you, Alex. I personally know that you have real estate business, and as you said, in Mongolia and some Asian countries, including United States. But please tell us that it might be interesting for our listeners that what is your portfolio structure? Personally, I mainly invest in stocks in long term, but it seems like you have real estate business, and it might be interesting for our listeners.
Absolutely, and I would suggest that my portfolio is pretty conservative, as with someone who primarily invests in real estate. It's always been my opinion that you should really invest in something that you know well. Investing in something that you don't know well runs a lot of risks. Where you have a knowledge advantage or an access advantage, that's where you should be putting your money. So today, just under 60% of my holdings are actually in equities, and a further 35% directly in real estate, the majority of which is commercial real estate. Most of the equities I'm invested in are related to the real estate business. And then there's around about 7%, which is really made up of cash and crypto. So it's relatively minor. So that's how I weight my current assets.
So the majority of your portfolio is the real estate, it seems like, yeah?
Real estate and related equities, yes. And so that's pretty risk off in general, and pretty long term.
Which means you're a safe investor, yeah?
That's what I learned. That's what I learned first, and so I've stuck with something that I know well, and I think that's a really critical thing to get out there, is that investing in something that's potentially higher risk, potentially equities, they're risk assets. If you don't know those particularly well, you run the risk of losing. True. Yes. So look to where you have an advantage.
Yeah. That's not true. So back to the topic, how do you see the investment environment in 2022?
So within Mongolia or globally?
Locally here in Mongolia and globally too.
So let's start with the global picture. I think we're coming to the end right now of a 50 to 75 year global cycle. And this is a global debt cycle, which is fairly cyclical. I mean, over the last few centuries. And we've seen a big build-up of debt. We've seen a lot of leverage. And the last couple of years, this has been exacerbated by COVID and countries' response to that, which has basically been to print money, which is in turn devaluing debt. And so we've seen a lot of the fallout from that in terms of this pull on inflation from this continued printing of currency. So we're now seeing the fallout, the response to that. And interest rates are now rising in the US. There is this is going to impact savings. This is going to obviously impact the amount of money available. Typically, when interest rates rise in the US, dollar-denominated investment in emerging markets tends to fall back.
To United States, yeah.
It tends to decrease because the arbitrage isn't there anymore. And we're now getting hit by a continuing overhang of COVID, which is logistics pressures on pricing as well. So input pricing is rising. The current Ukraine situation, of course, which is terrible, is again adding fuel to that fire of increasing input cost pressures. So all of this globally is leading to a situation where Mongolia is starting to see this. We have 16% inflation right now. We're expecting that to potentially rise somewhat. Because Mongolia remains within the sphere of influence in Russia, we might actually benefit from slightly reduced gasoline prices in the coming year. That remains to be seen. But nevertheless, we're going to be hit hard by potentially falling investment, higher input prices, very strong inflation. And so that is going to be the leitmotif for 2022, I feel.
Yeah. Yesterday, United States government reported that the February CPI was 7.9%.
Yeah.
It's pretty high for the developed countries, yeah?
Very high.
And especially the core CPI was 6.5%. So the core CPI, which definition is, it is removed that the factor of the food and energy. Yes. So it seems like Ukraine crisis was the fuel for the inflation. It was said, but it wasn't. Seems like. How do you see this correlation?
It's part of it, and it's just, for want of a better word, it's icing on the cake of two types of inflationary push that are already going on. Again, the first type is the overprinting of stimulus.
Yes.
So this is monetary inflation. So there's more money entering the environment. This is pushing prices up. It's also devaluing debt. And that's actually one of the reasons why I feel a lot of institutional investors have started to engage in the cryptocurrency market in the US, is because any debt that they were holding with this printing of cash, it basically draws down their economic value. It makes debt easier to pay, effectively. It makes it cheaper. This is one solution for keeping an economy rolling without having to increase taxes or decrease spending. It's basically to cheapen debt. So that's what's been happening. And so, but that if you overshoot with that kind of stimulus, you end up with that push, that inflationary push. On top of that, we have all of the fairly brittle supply chains we've seen from Asia going into the US, which has increased cost of inputs.
Yes.
And so that's a secondary cost push.
Yeah.
And between those two, we're experiencing high inflation. Hours. I mean, again, we've seen a drop-off of over 20% in the price of petrol on the Russian commodities exchange. So a lot of people in Mongolia are saying, well, we're in the sphere of influence of Russia, and we'll be able to buy cheaper than on global markets. And that's interesting that it's also potentially very disruptive to see a two-speed global economy emerging. And of course, WTI is coming down in price right now as of today. Yes. It's probably around 108, where it was up at 118. So a lot of the risk that people are perceiving right now is already been priced in and is in the sort of shaking out. We are in a situation, I think, where we're not going to see such a tremendous shock as we did, say, in the oil crisis of the 60s and 70s. There's less reliance now with greater move to electrification, both in terms of generating capacity and, of course, electric vehicles. So there's a little bit more elasticity. And again, per dollar of real GDP, our use of oil is lower and lower and lower than it used to be. So in that sense, and because there isn't a strict embargo, I don't think we're going to have that, real hard landing, that real hard shock that we did. But there's a lot still to shake out.
Oh, if that's true, that'll help us much more. But Russian government or Russian central bank raised its interest rate into 20%. So, which means there are pretty high inflation there.
Yes.
well-connected country as Mongolia with Russia.
Yeah.
So definitely there will be some effect from Russia, I guess. Maybe we can buy some oil from Russia at a cheaper price compared to WTI standardized price. But definitely there will be some impact from the Russia. How do you see inflation rate or mid or end of in 2022?
I mean, I see this increasing. I don't see any of the current shocks that we are undergoing being ameliorated in the near future or being reduced. We are probably likely, and that's a scary thought, that to see inflation in Mongolia, particularly in Ulaanbaatar, peak over 20. I don't see that as and again, we're seeing the purchasing power of the Tugrug also dropping back ever so slightly in the last couple of weeks. And I don't want this to be a story, entirely of doom and gloom. But we are expecting higher input costs. We haven't seen the full conclusion of some of the disruptions from COVID in terms of supply chains and inputs. And again, as you say, with significant increases in interest rates in Russia, this is going to cause, again, another set of shocks to the Mongolian economy. So at this point in time, we are likely to see inflation peak over 20%.
Over 20%.
But
I see.
Again, there are bright sides to this. I mean, gold is rallying. It's up 9% in the last month, around about 11% over the last 6 months. Obviously, this is a primary driver of Mongolian exports, but other factors such as copper are likely to be somewhat dampened because with slower global growth and again, China's expecting 5.5%, and even that is seen to be difficult. So again, key drivers like again coal, copper may not retain their prices quite so well in the next year.
Oh, I see. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, if we talk more, there are many subjects we can talk about on the economic situation. But as you said, the inflation rate here in Mongolia or Ulaanbaatar city, which will be peaked almost around 20%, you said. So for our viewers, what kind of measurement or investment best way or hedging the situation should be? What would you advise for us? So definitely there will be number one, real estate, yeah? Because it hedges the inflation rate.
It's a really good hedge against inflation. The problem is, of course, it typically is very large. Ticket size to invest in real estate is a very large investment. And it can be quite illiquid, particularly as cash flows become constrained. True. With rising interest rates, you tend to have a lot less cash in the market. That can lock up real estate markets. And so, if you're investing smaller sums of money, that can be slightly risky. And this is really talking to let's say retail investors, people, just average investors. That can be a risky play.
Yeah, true. But please advise on that. I say that real estate is the first option, but there are plenty of people who cannot invest in real estate. And for those people, what would you suggest?
There are a number of options, things like ETFs. There are even crypto-backed, effectively exchange-traded funds or REITs available. And they may invest in physical assets such as real estate or maybe even assets such as gold. And all of these are good inflation hedges. With markets such as that, though, with crypto markets, there are risks, of course. We are at very early stages now in terms of policy around real estate. Just a couple of days ago now, President Biden, signed a new order initiating a whole new round of investigation into crypto markets. Obviously, the digital asset law has now been passed in Mongolia, but the technology is still evolving, the policy environment is still evolving. There are significant risks associated with that. But what's interesting to me is that right now, cryptos themselves, Bitcoin, Ethereum, originally touted as digital gold by some, not by all, but by some, are now very much coupling with equities markets. Let's say the S&P. And the correlations are becoming higher and higher and higher. The correlations are actually even higher in emerging markets in terms of the relationships between top-tier crypto movements and the MSCI Emerging Markets Index. It's much, much stronger association than, say, the S&P 500. So that shows that there is a lot of emerging market engagement in cryptocurrency. But it trades as a risk asset. It trades like an equity would. And so it's not gold. So, you can look at asset-backed cryptos as a very good example. But be aware that in general, crypto markets trade closer to equities markets.
I see. Thank you. So you're suggesting as the gold and some ETFs, some ETFs on the real estate might be a good option, best option.
A very good option.
And you're saying also cryptos, yeah?
Yes.
But especially those cryptos having the real asset or business backed.
Something that's real asset backed. Again, as someone who's spent, I'm not that old, but the last 12 years really investing in fixed assets, large fixed assets. I see this over long term, over even a multi-generational timeline as being the best possible investment one can make. If you're looking at real estate, if you're looking at gold, these are multi-generational investments potentially. But and ETFs are a very good option. ETFs and REITs typically have outperformed and have been less volatile than equities, say the S&P or the FTSE. If you compare that to performance of most REITs in the United States, for example, they've been in downturns. They're much more stable because they have the backing of a real asset, and they tend to outperform over, I say, a 10 to 20 year period.
Oh, really? I've forgotten about that. What about the investing in commodities, especially oil? Now oil, it seems like pretty high volatile due to the WTI crude is now separated or disconnected with the northern oil.
Going back 20, 30 years, or even less than that, there's very low elasticity in terms of oil pricing, vis-a-vis improvements in wealth and so on and so forth, and demand. It was a very steep curve. Now there's greater elasticity because we have more alternatives, and I think in the long run, oil will be a little bit more stable almost because there will not be these big shocks in the same way. Right now, it's a great investment. I mean, I'm thinking now of things like nickel. As well. I mean, everyone wished they would have invested in nickel a week ago or 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, nickel hike, Freddie.
Huge, absolutely huge.
250%, yes.
Yeah.
But I heard it was due to some futures contract.
Yes.
Almost half of it is now cancelled.
It's cancelled out.
Yeah. So that 250% rise, isn't that real?
Yeah.
It's just something bubble.
And we saw this on it was the LME that cancelled a lot of these contracts.
LME cancelled it.
But still, I mean, this is indicative of what we might see if we enter a two-gear global economy. Again, aluminium is another one. Many companies in the US right now are struggling to source aluminium and have already been struggling to source aluminium for input factors. So aluminium pricing is set to continue to rise. These, again, rare earths is another one. These aren't so obvious to consumer investors as, let's say, gold or silver, but are really key areas. And again, the best way to invest in these types of products, if you're not an experienced commodities trader, is to maybe look towards ETFs.
Oh, yes.
And these kind of products. Because I think what we're really exploring here today is ways that people can generate wealth themselves. And right now, the big worry in the next 12 months is that a lot of wealth is going to get eaten away at by significant inflationary factors. So people need to find ways to insure themselves against that. And that could be, again, looking at real estate, could be looking at gold, could be looking at other commodities that are going to be in high demand for the coming cycle.
Yes.
But those cycles are far, far faster in commodities than they are in real estate. Real estate has a 10-year cycle on average. Depends changes by nation, but an average 10-year cycle. Commodities obviously have a much faster cycle.
Yes, I see. What about I think the last option maybe, what about the government bonds, for example, US 10-year treasuries and 1 year and 5 years?
So we're seeing, so again, in the last few weeks, there's been a flight to safety, and we can see that visibly in US 10 years. They've dropped pretty significantly. So demand is very, very high for US 10-year. And that shows a flight to safe assets. Again, this is part and parcel of the gold rise. The yield on bonds has dropped significantly, and again, take into account the increase in inflation as a factor in bond pricing, and it's pretty basic right now in terms of returns. But that flight to safety is ongoing. So yes, these are safe, secure assets, but they're not very, very high yielding right now.
I see. Personally, I use interactive brokers for ETF trading because we don't have ETF here in local Mongolia.
Yes.
So what kind of brokerage company do you use? Which might be interesting for our viewers.
So I use IB, and I also use some retail investment platforms such as Free Trade and Robinhood. But I use IB as well when I'm trading. So
thank you for your time, and especially thank you. You were my first guest for this Dulguun's podcast, and I think it will be get improved, and I will deliver useful information for our viewers and listeners. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to be here, and happy and safe investing, everybody.
Okay. Yes. За анхныхаа Dulguun's podcast-ийг та бүхэнд хүргэлээ. За анхных байсан учраас бас нэлээдгүй туршлагагүй, ярьж чадахгүй, асууж чадахгүй зүйлүүд байсан маа. Гэхдээ би аль болох та бүхэнд хэрэгтэй мэдээллийг хүргэх хэрэгчээж зорих болон за өнөөдрийн яриагаар би Алекстэй ялангуяа эдийн засгийн суурь, за инфляцтай холбогдуулаад за ямар хөрөнгө оруулалтыг хийж болох талаар та бүхэнд мэдээлэл хүргэж чадсан байх гэж найдаж байна. За тэгээд ялангуяа хөрөнгө оруулалт хийх үед инфляц гэдэг зүйл юу вэ? Түүнд ямар бодлого бариул зүгээр вэ гэдэг ойлголт бол маш чухал байгаад байдаг. За энэ удаад та бүхэнд би тэгээд подкаст болгондоо би та бүхэнд ямар нэгэн мэдээллийн их сурвалжийг бас танилцуулжээ гэж бодож байгаа. За энэ удаад би эдийн засгч ганц зөргийн бичсэн санхүүгийн философи гэдэг номыг санал болгож байна. Та бүхэн заавал уншаад үзээрэй. Ялангуяа хөрөнгө оруулалт хийж байгаа хүмүүс эдийн засгийн суурь ойлголт болох инфляцийн тухай илүү энгийнээр ойлгож мэдэхэд энэ ном нэлээдгүй тустай байх гэж бодож байна. Яагаад гэвэл бид нар түүхийг ямар нэгэн улс төр ч юм уу цэрэг армийн бодлого төлөлтөөр маш их хардаг. Гэтэл тухайн түүх болгонд бол мөнгө, за эдийн засгийн харилцаа гэдэг зүйл бол заавал байж идэг. Энэ цаанаа зөв бус буруу бодлого барьсан тохиолдолд инфляц нь яг хэрхэн эдийн засгт муугаар нөлөөлдөг вэ? Тэр нь магадгүй бидний анзааргүй хэмжээнд тухайн улсыг мөхөлд хүртэл оруулж исэн гэдэг иймэрхүү онцгой гоё жишээгээр тайлбарласан юм гоё ном байдаг. За анхаарал тавин сонссон та бүхэндээ маш их баярлалаа. Ингээд дараагийн дугаараар уулзах хүртлээр түр баяртай.